Hello and welcome to part 5 of the VR character series. Today we will be adding melee weapon logic for hitting and penetrating. A word of caution, the penetration logic is still experimental. The current system does the job, however I will probably rework it in a future video when I eventually find a better way of doing it. Anyway, let's start by importing some assets from Fab. I will leave a link to all assets used in the description. First, we need to fix the object scale and origins. Drag out the object, for example the blade, switch to modeling and under X form select edit pivot. Now adjust the pivot so it's in the location where you want to grab your object. Then hit accept and rotate the object so the blade looks in the X axis and the object appears to be upside down pointing along the -Z axis and select bake transform. Make sure to only bake the rotation and the full scale. I first planned on using sockets to tell the player where to grab the weapon, however due to physics this was rather impractical, since it seemed like the socket was not always where it seemed to be and therefore it always had an offset. I understand that this is tedious, but it only needs to be done once and I haven't found a better way that worked. Additionally, when you're using your own assets, you can easily change this in your modeling program. Now that that's out of the way, let's create a new folder called Weapons inside the Blueprints folder. In that folder, right-click, select Blueprint, and then create two new enumerations called E_damage type and E_weapon melee type. In the damage type, add two rows called Hit and Penetration. We will use these in a future video to play an animation based on what kind of damage we dealt to an enemy. In the weapon melee type enum, add two rows called Blunt and Sharp. Go back to the weapons folder and create a new actor blueprint called BP_weapon base. First, let's create the variables we need. The first one is called weapon melee type and of type E_weapon melee type. Then we need to know if we overlap an actor that we can penetrate. So let's call this actor variable overlap penetrable actor. Then add a public float variable called damage. I will give it the default value of 10. To limit how fast we can hit, let's add two float variables called hit rate with a default value of 0.2 and a variable called last hit time. We only want the weapon to penetrate another object at a certain speed. Call the float variable min penetration speed and set a default value of 2.0. We use a physics constraint to make the weapon stick in the penetrated object. Therefore, we need a float variable called limit brake force with a default value of 10,000. At last, we need to know which bone and component we penetrated, so create a variable of type name called penetrated bone and another of type primitive component called penetrated component. That's it for the variables. However, we still need to add a static mesh called weapon mesh, a collision box called penetration hitbox, and a physics constraint called penetration constraint. Set the collision box collision preset to overlap all. In the physics constraint, make sure to set all angular limits to locked. The weapon mesh should simulate physics. If you cannot tick checkbox, select any mesh, tick it, and remove the mesh again. Make sure the collision preset is set to grabbable object and tick the simulation generates hit events and generate overlap events checkboxes. To calculate the hit interval, we add a pure function called check interval. We want two float input values called value and interval and one bool output. Get the time seconds and subtract the value. Check if the result is greater or equal to the interval and return the condition. I created the function this way so we can use it for other intervals as well. The next function we need is called setPenetrationConstraint and has a primitive component input called componentToConstrain and a name input called boneToConstrain. First, we set the componentToConstrain as the penetrated component and the boneToConstrain as the penetrated bone. Then we get the physics constraint and set the constraint components where the weapon mesh is the component 1 and the component to constrain the component 2, together with the bone to constrain as the bone name 2. The last function is called deal damage and has an actor input called actor to damage and a damage type input. Before we can continue, we need to go to the blueprints folder and add a new folder called interfaces. In that folder, add a new blueprint interface called BPI_damageable. For now, the interface has one function called damage, with a damage type input and a float input called amount. Now, plug in our weapon-based blueprint in the deal damage function, cast the actor to damage to the interface. Call the check interval function and input last hit time into value and hit rate into the interval input. Connect the bool output to a branch. If the condition is true, call the getTimeSeconds function and set it as the last hit time value. At last, call the damage function of the interface and input the damage type and the damage. Great, now we have all the functions we need and we can go back to the event graph. Call the begin play function and add a switch for the weapon melee type. When the weapon type is blunt, we destroy the physics constraint and collision box component since we don't need to do any penetration tests. If the type is sharp, get the physics constraint and bind a custom event to onConstraint broken and set linear breakable to true with our limit break force variable as the threshold. In the onConstraint broken event, check if the penetrated component is valid, and if it is, set the constraint component to the mesh and the penetrated component with the penetrated bone. Then call deal damage and input the overlap penetrable actor and set the damage type to penetration. This will cause damage every time you move the weapon after it's stuck. Next, we set up the logic for blunt hits. Select the weapon mesh and right-click. Expand, add event for weapon mesh, collision, and add an on-component hit event. Check if the owner is valid and if the penetrated component is invalid. We do this because we don't want the weapon to deal damage just by laying on the ground, and we also don't want it to deal additional damage when penetrating since we already deal damage there. Next, call the deal damage function and input the other actor. The damage type is hit. If you want, you can also play a sound, spawn particles and spawn decals at the hit location. I will show you how to do this, but I won't use it yet. Break the hit result and get a play sound at location node. Input the location of the hit result. Next, get the node, spawn system attached, input the hit location, component, and hit bone name. Get the rotation from X vector of the impact normal and input it as the rotation and make sure auto destroy is ticked. Then get the node spawn decal attached. Set the decal size to 10.0. I don't know why, but Unreal Engine sometimes has issues spawning decals below a certain size. Then input the rest like we did when spawning the particles. That's it for the hit event. Next we will set up the penetration. Get the component begin and end overlap events of the penetration hitbox. Check if the owner is valid. Then check if the other actor has a tag called penetrable, and if the other actor does not equal the owner. If it is the owner, it would mean we've hit the player, which in this case we don't want to be able to stab. Add a branch and input the previous condition. If true, send the overlapped penetrable actor to the other actor. Get the weapon mesh physics linear velocities vector length. Multiply it by the world delta seconds and check if it is greater than the min penetration speed. If it is, call our previously created function, set penetration constraint, input the other component, and the hit bone name of the sweep result. Then call the deal damage function, input the other actor, and set the damage type to penetration. In the end overlap event, we want to check if the other actor is equal to the overlapped penetrable actor. And if it is, we set the overlap penetrable actor and penetrated component variable to null and the penetrated bone to none. Then break the constraint. This is it for the weapon base class. At last, we go into the VR character blueprint and change the start grabbing function. Add a new input called other grabbed actor of type actor and another input called motion controller of type motion controller component. I've changed it to do the sphere trace from the location of the motion controller instead of the hand's actual position because the old way felt more frustrating at times. I also changed the grab radius from 5 to 10. We input the other grab component because we want to be able to hold a weapon in both hands, and if we don't check if we're already holding the object, it would always snap the object to the grip position instead of grabbing it where we wanted to. Add another branch before the set constraint components node and check if the hit actor does not equal the other grabbed actor. If the condition is true, set the hit actor's location and rotation to the physics constraint and tick teleport. If the condition is false, we want to directly set the constraint components. Back in the event graph, go to the right grabbing input and connect the left grab actor and RMC to the start grabbing function and add a sequence. First, check if the grab actor is valid and then set the player as its owner. Then, set the right grabbed actor as before. Add a sequence after stop grabbing and connect a branch to the first output, checking if the right grabbed active is not equal to the left grabbed active. If the condition is true, set the owner to null. From the second output of the sequence, set the right grabbed actor variable to null as before. Now do the same for the left. Before we create the weapons, I recommend that you go to the Mannequin's physics asset and set the angular limits of all arm joints to 3. This will give you a bit more range of motion. Back in the weapons folder, right-click on the weapons base blueprint and create a child blueprint class. I will call this class VP_blade. In this class you can set your weapon mesh and adjust the default variables. I'll spare you the individual setup and just show a screenshot of the settings I am using. Make sure the penetration hitbox spans over the part of the weapon which you want the penetration to start with, and position the physics constraint in the middle of the blade. The physics constraint position will determine the pivot the blade will rotate around when stuck. I also suggest recreating the collision boxes for the meshes so they're more accurate. At last, go to the viewport, add a cylinder, and add an actor tag called penetrable. Now you can test your weapons. In the next tutorial, we will be adding projectile weapons. Until then, let me know in the comments if you need any help or if there is another tutorial you would like me to create. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!